Dr. Messud.
Hi, everybody. It's exciting and thrilling to be here. I want to thank Leah and everyone else, and it's a huge honor to read with Carl, and it's great to see faces that I haven't seen for some time. I was last here, I think, 2007, when some of you were still in high school, or maybe even like middle school. I can't even really think about it. Okay, but it's very exciting to be here. So I thought I'd read something depressing. Seemed like a good way to kick things off. But just to be difficult, my most recent book, I write fiction largely. That's what I do. My most recent book is a book of essays, including personal essays, and I thought I would read to you a part of an essay, or the beginning and end of an essay from this book, which is called Kant's Little Prussian Head, for really good reasons that are explained in an essay that I'm not going to read. So you'll just have to wonder about that. But the essay that I'm going to read to you from is called The Road to Damascus. And, you know, can I just say, like, I'm a person, I have a problem that I stop watches. Like, I always wear a watch, and somehow, since I got on the plane to come here, my watch doesn't keep time anymore. So I thought I would but like, I'm too dumb to, so now I have like a black phone screen. So I don't really know how to keep time here, but I'm sorry. Do you have to, well, just come and haul me off if I'm going off on too long, I guess is the thing. Anyway, okay. The Road to Damascus. I went to Beirut in June 2010 because my father was dying. This sentence, palpably illogical, my father was not dying in Beirut, is nonetheless true. When my father was in the hospital in 2008 after nearly dying from a perforated ulcer, then from MRSA, a superbug, the doctors said to him categorically, "You drink, you die." We all heard them, we talked about it, and for almost 2 years he did not drink and he didn't die. And then early in 2010, in remission from a cancer diagnosed a year before that, he started drinking again. I don't know whether he died because he drank, or whether he drank because he was sure he was going to die, or because he was afraid to die and wanted to forget about it, or because he just wanted by then to die. After all, my mother, who had Lewy body dementia, was slipping quietly away. It is strange to understand that all of these things can be true at once. Suffice it to say, he drank, he died. In late April 2010, my father had a stroke. They realized once he was in the hospital that after a respite of 10 months, his esophageal cancer was back in force. His throat was fully dammed. There was not even room in his gullet for his spit to slip down to his stomach. The oncologist, a bluff fellow of the old school, eminently clubbable, who prided himself on his frankness and resembled British generals in black and white war films with his bow tie and his tidy white mustache, confided oddly jauntily in the hallway outside my father's room some days later, "Within 6 to 8 weeks, he'll be in trouble." In between the oncologist's first prognosis in the corridor of the hospital and my father's last breath, there was a Bergsonian eternity, moment upon moment upon moment of being. My father was always intolerant of small talk and banality. He very much wanted time to mean. In this sense, those last 3 months were very much his time. But inevitably, too, there was stupid time interspersed between the significant time that wouldn't necessarily, in ordinary circumstances, have been considered stupid, but which, in the context of death, became strangely preposterous. Watching television, of course, becomes impossible in a crisis. But even the matter of living my own life became largely absurd to me. Teaching classes, participating in panel discussions, attending readings, ridiculous. Perhaps ironically, the daily household tasks, when rarely I was at home with my family, seemed immensely precious. Making breakfast, folding the children's clothes, the small connections to the ordinary, a place where we wanted the children at all costs to remain. Some months before, I had committed to going to teach in Beirut for a fortnight in the second half of June. When the oncologist first gave my father 6 to 8 weeks, it was the beginning of May. 6 weeks would coincide almost exactly with my departure for Beirut, 8 weeks with my return. I didn't know what to do, whether to cancel the trip straight away. 2 years before, when my father was so ill, I had canceled everything, stopped my life altogether. Afterward, I came closer to jumping off a bridge than ever before. This time, with this knowledge, it didn't seem a good idea simply to withdraw. Just wait and see, said my husband, my sister, the doctors. Just wait and see. As the weeks went by and my time to leave approached, my father was clearly suffering more. By the end of May, they stopped his rehabilitation. The stretches when he was awake and not in pain grew shorter. The pain, when it was present, grew more intense. One of the nurses explained that it was as if a digger were scooping away at his insides, an internal excavation. My mother, unable to articulate her terror, grew intensely anxious, a wraith flitting through the corridors of the nursing home whenever I was not there or my sister was not there, always looking for us, for someone, driving my father crazy. So much fear. And still, I clung to the prospect of Beirut. I was to teach at the American University there, a trip organized by the International Writing Program at Iowa in conjunction with the American University of Beirut, AUB, and with assistance from the State Department. It was the pilot program for a possible regular summer teaching course. Only 2 of us were going, a poet and myself, a fiction writer. In those weeks, as I waited for the details of the trip, I had in my mind the State Department-sponsored visit I'd made to Istanbul several years before, a week of classes and meetings with writers and university professors and students, a trip that offered me the promise of Turkish culture like a glorious flower unfolding, mysterious and immense and amazing. The teeming enormity that is Istanbul and the intensity of my encounters had imparted to that visit a particular aura of necessity. It had seemed important to go to Istanbul. It had seemed important for me to go to Istanbul. It had seemed important for me to go at that time to Istanbul. Needless to say, Istanbul was also bound up with my father. Istanbul was the first city my father had consciously fallen in love with as a boy of 10, arriving at its mouth by boat with his family in the middle of the Second World War. My grandfather, who was sentimental, described it as a coup de foudre for his child. My father, who was, if not less sentimental, considerably more reserved, conceded that he had wanted from the first to go back there. My grandfather was a consular attaché in the French Navy, at that point under orders from Vichy, and so my young father and his younger sister were boarded outside the city at the residence of the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion in Therapia, now Tarabya, where they spent the 40 days that their parents remained in Istanbul. My grandparents, briefly childless, inhabited a furnished flat overlooking the Bosphorus and engaged in minor daring-do, befriending Sub Rosa, the English envoy to Turkey, a man named Ellerington, who would resurface later in the war in Algiers when they were all finally officially on the same side. My father and aunt were photographed, meanwhile, tiny and lost in the overgrown gardens of the pensionnat in Therapia, where few children remained because it was summertime. Over those weeks, my father and aunt learned to swim in the Bosphorus. The children were tied under the armpits by ropes and dropped into the water by a near nun. It would seem that the Sisters of Sion were complicatedly nunnish, but not fully nuns, in a near habit, who then paraded up and down the jetty holding onto this lead. In this way, the children, ostensibly undrownable, swam several lengths without being drawn out into the strait by the swift current to perish at sea. I am not sure whether the swimming mistress held the rope of one child at a time or of several children at once, like a dog walker in Central Park. More than half a century later, my father remembered the beauty of the light on the Bosphorus, the precise yet glaucous outlines of the buildings in Sultanahmet in the early day. He'd held that beauty in his mind's eye in palimpsest, the overlaid and changing memory of all his visits to the city. He returned to Istanbul as a teenager for a summer as soon as he was able to travel alone, and had his wallet and passport stolen before ever he arrived at the port, a vanishing which seemed somehow symbolic, to be searching in the maze of a city for something essential and irretrievable, for some impossible belonging. Much later, he learned Turkish and embarked upon a PhD at Harvard on Turkish political parties. He and my mother passed through Istanbul on their way to Ankara, where they lived for 6 months in the late 1950s in order for him to pursue his research. She, not yet 30, fresh from Toronto, whose limited travel experience had been entirely in Western Europe, wrote home detailed and emotional letters to her parents describing what it was like for a young Canadian woman in Ankara in 1959, her indignation when she witnessed a bus driver deliberately running over a dog, the thrill of collecting shards of ancient pottery at a friend's archaeological dig, her alternating frustration and amusement at the daily struggles to communicate with the housekeeper. She approved of the food, although not as much as my father, who would all his life love this cuisine best of any. He, meanwhile, filled a briefcase with notes in his spiky scrawl in French and English and Turkish, a briefcase that moldered for many years in the basement of my parents' house in Canada, and which, after his death, we finally threw away. My father abandoned the PhD. My mother did not ultimately care for life in Ankara, and besides, my father felt that if they wanted to have children, he would need to earn what he called a proper living. Instead, as a businessman, he amassed over 50 years a scholar's collection of books on Byzantium, the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, the Turks, the Middle East more broadly. Upon his death, he left behind hundreds of volumes, though how many of them he had read I cannot say. He left, that is to say, substantial traces of the life unlived, of the internal life, which is, as we all know, both hard to discern and the only one that matters. And so, in this sense, it had been a pilgrimage for him, my trip to Istanbul, a trip he was then still well enough to applaud and appreciate. It was my own trip, too, of course, the thrill of the invitation, the excitement of setting one foot in Europe and another in Asia, the little glasses of steaming tea served on the ferries from one side of the strait to another, the view of the passing boats from my hotel room, the joy of wandering the mosques in the Topkapi Palace alone on my day off, of negotiating the subway system with my 3 words of Turkish, of slipping into the plush seats at the cinema alongside a wonderfully cantankerous old American acquaintance from Boston and his deferential Turkish students to see, of all strange things, Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis. No, it was my own trip too, but its ultimate raison d'etre was my father. So too with Beirut. My father, before he ever saw Istanbul, was a child in Beirut. Beirut was his Eden. My grandfather was first posted there as naval attaché to the French consulate in 1936 before the war. My father was just 5 years old, my aunt 3. They lived in a villa on an ascendance at what was then the edge of town and is now indiscernibly incorporated into the city, a place that has not only vanished, but the very notion of which has vanished. It was my grandparents' first moment of relative prosperity. Until then, they had been frankly poor, and only in Beirut did they have the luxury of a housekeeper. There, too, they bought their first furniture, which they would take with them to their next posting, only to have it evaporate a few years later, mid-war, when the ship carrying it belatedly back to Algeria was torpedoed in the Mediterranean. From Beirut in 1939, they were dispatched to Salonika, now Thessaloniki. There, they heard word of the French defeat and the armistice. My grandfather, who spent a decade of his retirement writing a 1,500-page handwritten memoir of his life for his granddaughters, for my sister and myself, records the shame and horror of this development. But he was also a follower of rules and of order, and so, rather than rebel, he followed the command that then emanated from Vichy, taking him back to Beirut in 1940 and on to Istanbul in 1941. Their Beirut of before the war is recorded in family photographs as a time of outings and parties. The children are captured in elaborate fancy dress, my father as a court page in red velveteen bloomers with white and gold brocade, complete with feathered toque, my aunt as a tiny princess in layers of frothy skirts. Among others similarly attired, all staring dumbly off into the corners of the frame as photographed children are wont to do. The grown-ups are pictured smiling in the streets or at the Saint-Georges Hotel on the waterfront. Their letters talk of the ease and beauty of it all, the fragrant flowers in the garden, and the warmth of the local welcome. There was food enough for everyone. At the weekends, there were outings to the mountains, throughout an abundance of fresh oranges and sweet cakes and coffee, and always the sunshine and their beloved Mediterranean extending outside to the horizon. The return to Beirut in 1940 was much darker. Food, while plentiful in comparison to other places, was considerably more difficult to procure than it had been. The children suffered from headaches and earaches and colds. Housekeepers were in short supply, as was money to pay for them. My father, now 9 and stoical, lived with his family in an apartment on the Rue Ashrafieh, at the summit of the hill in what is still today the Christian district. There was then a French air base across the road. The children attended the French elementary school only a few blocks away on the corner of the Rue de Damas, the road to Damascus, where now there stands a large modern tower containing offices, luxury apartments, and shops. My father and aunt did not know that times were worse. They knew only that they had returned to their beloved Beirut. All through the rest of the war that was their childhood, by the time it was over, my father was almost 14 and no longer strictly speaking a child. After they were back in Algiers, keeping a chicken in a muck of straw on their tiny balcony for its eggs, until the afternoon it took alarm at the children's antics and fluttered dizzily down to the courtyard, only to be slaughtered by a neighbor for supper. or queuing endlessly for rations to find that the meat or the rice or the butter had run out, or hiding in the air raid shelters overnight in the unsettled stretch when school was canceled for weeks. And my grandmother, in hope of salvaging the year, dragged my father around to tutor after tutor, including for Latin an aged monk in grimy attire, crammed with his parents into a small and filthy flat on the outskirts of town, with an entire flock of pigeons in cages on the porch, or being shipped out to ancient aunts in the countryside in the hope that there they would have calm and food. Throughout all that time, the children spoke of Beirut as the answer. My father wrote more than once in his looped, still childish hand to his father far away, first in Toulon, then in Dakar, then in Casablanca, that he wished they were back in Beirut where, for the children at least, everything had been good. None of the complications of war featured in my father's Beirut, or if they did so only decades later in retrospect. My father's Beirut was his happy home, the place he could first clearly remember, where life was comfortable and Mommy and Daddy were happy and school was exciting and everything seemed to lie ahead and to be possible. The city's perfection was always a myth, but a myth so perfectly imprinted that when, before I left for my own trip there, I sat next to him in the nursing home and asked him to draw a map of the city as he remembered it, he shifted in his wheelchair and closed his eyes for a moment, and then, having moved the pen back and forth above the page a few times in a hovering motion, drew a perfect outline of the city's coast and penned in the port and the Saint-Georges and the American University in Ras Beirut, and the Pigeon Rocks offshore, and the Rue de Damas heading inland and uphill, all exactly as they are in life. Although since leaving in 1941, he'd only been back in Beirut for 48 hours some 30 years later, just before the Civil War, a stopover born of a somewhat garbled matter of lost luggage on the way back from Hong Kong. When I showed the map to my Lebanese architect friend, he marveled at its accuracy. And then, too, my father put down in the same black ink and, of course, with the same certainty, the souk where they shopped for food, and Tanyos, the central department store to which his mother used to take him, and the airbase across the road from his apartment building, all of these things gone now, or transformed beyond recognition, and certainly beyond caring, in a city which has suffered and survived so much in the intervening decades. Yet, for as long as he lived, they existed, absolutely, in all their vividness, in my father's memory, and he could indicate them for me on a scrap of lined yellow paper, and so insist upon their continued reality, their absolute importance, perfectly preserved in every detail. You do know, don't you, that in the moment in which he closed his eyes, before he drew his map, he knew the quality of the light, the shadows cast by the buildings in the road, the clattering of the cars passing, and the mingling smells in the street of cooking fat and gasoline and dirt, and the ruts in the pavement beneath the thin soles of his shoes, and the fine layer of dust upon those shoes, and the weight of the department store door, and the texture of its handle as it swung open, and the warmth, too, of his mother's hand, cold now for almost 30 years, in the precious box of his childhood mind for 7 decades, and finally, taken out unblemished at the last for me. And now he is dead, and these memories have dissolved into the ether, and all that remains is the yellow slip of paper folded and already worn in the pocket of my diary, a mere desiccation, a sign stripped of its significance. Everybody thinks this, I know, but I think it now with great confusion. How can it be that all that is in us dies with us? How can it be that those memories, that Beirut, which had existed 70 years in its locked corner of his mind, but not the less real or immediate for that, have now simply ceased to be? I cannot understand it. That we cannot know something unless we are told it, this seems to me the greatest weakness of any supposed divine plan, the primary reason to doubt. On the afternoon when he drew his map, I asked my father whether he would like me not to go. All you have to do is say you'd like me to stay, I said, and I will stay. I can cancel it. I had in my head that the trip was important, somehow important for my father, and in order that I might bring him some gift, not an actual gift, of course, but an emotional gift, and that this would make his parting easier. I was aware, even as I had this idea in my head, that it was a silly novelistic idea and not a true thing. But then, too, on some level, even when he was so sick, I really wanted to go. I'd also been with them, my parents, almost all the time for 6 weeks, and it was hard, and he was in pain and often sour-tempered, and she was growing increasingly anxious, and I wasn't sure that I could do this indefinitely, this nursing thing. My father may have read my mind. He closed his eyes again, the kind of closing that may have been thinking or may have been necessary to ride out a wave of pain, this latter a type of eye closing I know only from childbirth. And then he said, no, I think it's important that you go. And so I went. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, scary now that I see everyone. There's a sign here that says point microphone at your mouth. Thanks, Claire. That was terrific. And now Carl. Here I am. So I told you I could say it. All right, so it's great to be here. It's my first time ever being at Sewanee Writers Conference, so I'm very honored. And I'm going to read 10 poems, or fewer, but not more. When I'm at a reading, I like to know what I'm in for. So you know, it won't be more than that. And let's look at the time. Oh, and thanks to Gwen and Adam and Leah for all the work you're doing and bringing me here. I appreciate it. All right, so I'm going to read 3 poems from my book, Wild as the Wind. This one's called Gold Leaf. It's, despite what a reviewer said, a reviewer said it was one long extended sentence, but it's not. It's an extended fragment. So he didn't know his grammar. It's called Gold Leaf. To lift without ever asking what animal exactly it once belonged to, the socketed helmet that what's left of the skull equals, up to your face, to hold it there, mask-like, to look through it until looking through means looking back through the skull, into the self that is partly the animal you've always wanted to be, that, depending, fear has prevented or rescued you from becoming, to know utterly what you'll never be, to understand in doing so what you are, and say no to it, not to who you are, to say no to despair. This poem is called Stray. When he speaks of deserved and undeserved as more than terms, how they can matter suddenly, I can tell he believes it. Sometimes a thing can seem star-like when it's just a star, stripped of whatever small form of joy likeness equals. Sometimes the thought that I'm doomed to fail, that the body is, keeps me almost steady, if steadiness is what a gift for a while brings. Feathers, burst at last pods of milkweed, October, before it all fades away. Before the drugs and the loud music, before tears and restraining orders, and the eventual, go fuck yourself, get your ass out of here, don't go. The apartments across the street were a boys' grammar school. Before that, a convent, the only remains of which, ornamenting the far parking lot, is a marble pedestal with some Latin on it that translates as Heart of Jesus, have mercy, as if that much at least still remained relevant, or should. If it's true that secrets resist always the act of telling, how come secrets more often than not seem the entire story? Caladium, Cleome, how delicate this holding of certain words in the mouth, the all but lost trick of lifting for salvage the last windfalls as across them the bees make their slow-muscled, stunned, moving scab. Are these depressing too? Are we like in a theme? I didn't think what you read was depressing. I thought it was quite beautiful. Okay, and this is the title poem of this book. It's called Wild as the Wind. About what's past, hold on when you can, I used to say, and when you can't, let go, as if memory were one of those mechanical bulls, easily dismountable should the ride turn rough. I lived in those days at the forest's edge, metaphorically, so it can sometimes seem now, though the forest was real, as my life beside it was. I spent much of my time listening to the sounds of random, unknowable things dropping or being dropped from, variously, a middling height or a great one, until, by winter, it was just the snow falling, each time like a new, unnecessary taxonomy or syntax for how to parse what's plain, snow, from which the occasional lost hunter would emerge every few or so seasons, and just once, a runaway child whom I gave some money to and told no one about, having promised. You must keep what you've promised very close to your heart. That way you'll never forget, is what I've always been told. I've been told quite a lot of things. They hover, some more unbidden than others, in that part of the mind where mistakes and torn wishes echo as in a room that's been newly cathedraled, so that the echo surprises. Though lately, it's less the echo itself that can still most surprise me about memory. It's more the time it takes, going away. A mouth opening to say, I love sex with you too, it doesn't mean I want to stop my life for it, for example. Or just a voice, mouthless, asking, since when does the indifference of the body's stance when we're alone, unwatched, in late light, amount to cruelty? For the metaphysical poets, the problem with weeping for what's been lost is that tears wash out memory, and by extension, what we'd hoped to remember. If I refuse increasingly to explain, isn't explanation at the end of the day what the sturdier truths most resist? It's been my experience that tears are useless against all the rest of it, that if I could, I'd forget. That I keep wanting to stay should count at least for something. I'm not done with you yet. Okay, so that's the first suite. See, we're timing it along. 3, so now there's 3 poems. Now it's going to mean 6, and it'll just be 4 more, right? So I'm just telling you how you play that game. This is called On Being Asked to Be More Specific When It Comes to Longing. When the forest ended, so did the star flowers and wild ginger that for so long had kept us company. The clearing opened before us, a vast meadow of silverrod, each stem briefly an angled argument against despair, then only weeds, by a better name again, as incidental as the backdrop the ocean made just beyond the meadow. Like taking a horsewhip to a swarm of bees, that they might more easily disperse, we'd at last reached the point in twilight where twilight seems most a bowl, designed to turn routinely but as if by accident half roughly over. Bells somewhere, the kind of bells that, before being housed finally in their towers, used to have to be baptized. Each was given, to swing by or fall hushed inside of, accordingly, its own name. Bells, and then, from the smudged edge of all that seemed to be left of what we called belief once, bodies, not of hunting birds, what we'd thought at first, but human bodies, in flight and lit from within as if by ruin, or triumph maybe, at having made out of ruin a light, something useful by which, having skimmed the water, to search the meadow now for ourselves inside it, where, yes, though we shook in our nakedness, we lay naked as we'd been taught to do. When afraid, what is faith but to make a gift of yourself? Give, and you shall receive. I guess I should say these poems are from this book called Pale Colors in a Tall Field. I don't know why I should say that, because the publisher would like it. Here's a really short poem called Overheard Under a Dark Enchantment. It rhymes. It does. Overheard under a dark enchantment. Compassion first, we were told. And if that won't work, compassion's shadow, pity, to smooth what's rough. We find just holding the victim's hand lately has been exactly enough. In case you think I'm not aware of it, I'm aware that bees have come up a couple times. They're going to come up one more time, like now. I think it's because I've been working on my relationship with bees over the last few years, trying to be at one with them instead of running, flailing my arms, screaming. This is called If It Must Be Winter, and the title comes from, it's the last line from a poem by Linda Gregg that goes, if it must be winter, let it be absolutely winter. Anyway, that's where the title comes from. If it must be winter. Not crowns, not conquest defined in terms of how many fear you or fear to say otherwise. Not by these will you know your own royalty, but in smaller ways, how to the least gesture there's more power than seems reasonable, though it will feel deserved. So I was told, and they have not proved wrong. I've but to open my hand, bees come to it, the slick fur of bees assembling as toward an honor in no way expected, though each time the honor remains mine, as if almost it should, as if certain privileges had to do with destiny. Do I believe that? Do I? My hand a sea, across which the wings of the bees flash like signal flags whose patterns, instead of translating, I make up my own translations for. I shall do as I please. As a lovely argument can make a difficult truth more clear, if not more sweet, though is there not a sweetness to clarity that can almost make the truth seem worth it? To say I'm not quite sure makes me no less king here. Sometimes I open my hand and there's no sea at all, just a windy plain. What appear to be dust storms crossing it turn out, on reaching me, to be the disappointments, all of them, that I never intended, each one on horseback, my cavalry, each face raised toward mine as if awaiting command, hungering for it, forgetful or stupid. I can see no difference. Look away from me. I haven't said you can look at me. And I'm going to finish with some poems there from a book coming out next year called Then the War. And I don't know why I sighed so heavily about it. It's from a book called Then the War. And so I'll read 4 of those and I'll be that. Okay, this is called On Coming Close. On coming close. The horses we rode, they must all be dead by now. But the self, who I was then, can almost seem unchanged still if I meet no mirrors to allow what's outside to betray what's in. If I think of regret as I've always thought of it, no more useful than apology, no less impossible to believe in than forgiveness. If I forget, as I tend to, regret's powers. Without mirrors, my eyes are the color of river water crossing a bed of stones, river stones in summer. Without mirrors, I can almost say yes, yes to holiness, the river lower than usual because summer, but the sky Novembering, so the water the color of what's from the start been at once unknowable, yet understood somehow. Not one of those horses ever came even close to that color, being horses, not rivers, which makes me want to forgive them just a little, in spite of myself. or to say I loved some small part of even the worst of them. Love. Isn't love what they used to call holiness once, long ago, on earth? Okay, this poem is called Then the War. They planted flowers because the house had many rooms, and because they'd imagined a life in which cut flowers punctuate each room, as if each were a sentence, not just to be decorated, but to be given some discipline, with the most memorable sentences, like people, always slightly resist. Spit of land, rags of cloud rack. Meanwhile, hawk's nest, winter nest, stamina as a form of faith, little cove that a life equals, what they meant, I think, by what they called the soul, twilight taking hold deep in the marshweed, in the pachysandra, where the wind can't reach. Then the war. Then the field and the mounted police parading their proud-looking horses across it. Then the next morning's fog, the groundsmen barely visible inside it, shadow-like, shade-like, grooming the field back to immaculateness. Then the curtains billowing out from the lightless room toward the sea. Then the one without hair stroked the one who had some. They closed their eyes, if gently, hard to say how gently. Then the war was nothing that still bewildered them, if it ever had. Right? And two more poems. This poem mentions, what does it mention? The Iliad. But don't feel you have to have read it. You don't, though I recommend it. It's called Something to Believe in. My two hunting dogs have names, but I rarely use them. As I go, they go. I lead, they follow. The blue-eyed one first, then the one who's coloring her coat, not her eyes, I sometimes call never again, oh never this way henceforth. Hope, ambition, these are not their names, though the way they run might suggest otherwise. Like steam off night-soaked wooden fencing when the sun first hits it, they rise each morning at my command. Late in the Iliad, Priam, the king of Troy, predicts his own murder, correctly, except it won't be by spear, as he imagines, but by sword thrust. He can see his corpse, sees the dogs he's fed and trained so patiently, pulling the corpse apart. After that, he says, when they're full, they'll lie in the doorway. They'll lap my blood. I say, why shouldn't they? Everywhere, the same people who mistake obedience for loyalty think somehow loyalty weighs more than hunger, when it doesn't. At night, when it's time for bed, we sleep together, the three of us. Muscled animal, muscled animal, muscled animal. The dogs settle to either side of me, as if each were the slightly folded wing of a beast from fable, part power, part recognition. We breathe in a loose kind of unison. Our breathing ripples the way oblivion does, routinely, across history's face. And I'm just going to finish with this very short poem. It's called Of the Shining Underlife. And that, too, you might think, is this what Carl does for titles? Just steal them from everyone? Mostly now. And this is it's a line from a poem called The Minx by Toy Derricott. So anyway, it's called Of the Shining Underlife. Above me, the branches toss toward and away from each other, the way privacy does with what ends up showing, despite ourselves, of who we are inside. Then they're branches again. Hickory, I think. It's not too late then. Thanks.